All right, guys, today we're going to be looking at the promises God made to Abram. Now, Abram is also known as Abraham, so don't be confused by that. The section we'll be looking at is before he gets the name changed. And so we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 12, the very first few verses, and then Genesis 15 will be the main focus of our study. There's so many details to Abram's life, we can't take our time on every single one. And so we're going to hit the high points. And the promises that God made to Abram are the high point. That is the focus here. And so prior to Abram, we don't get a lot of information about him. In Genesis chapter 11, we get to see his lineage, his family tree. And so other than that, we don't know a ton about him before God speaks to him. And then in Genesis chapter 12, it just says, the Lord said to Abram. He said to Abram, and God goes on to make this promise to Abram about what he was going to do through Abram, how he was going to bless him, and how ultimately Abram was, that the Lord was going to bless all the nations of the earth through Abram. And so we'll get to see how he does that. And so God makes these big promises to Abram. And as we go on, we see that Abram, he makes some mistakes in Genesis chapter 13. He makes a mistake and lies to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then in Genesis chapter 14, we see that actually there were some wars and different fights going on that Abram was involved with. And then we go to Genesis 15, where we know some time has passed. We know there's been a length of time passed since God made that promise in Genesis chapter 12 about all these things that he was going to do with Abram, how he's going to bless all the nations of the earth through Abram. And so we don't know how much time has passed, but we know time has elapsed since that promise. And when we pick up in Genesis 15, God is speaking to Abram once again. And he's telling him, don't be afraid. I'm your protector, and your reward will be very great. And Abram, we see in his response, there's some discouragement. You see, God had made this big promise to him back in Genesis 12, and it appears he hasn't made good on that promise. He hasn't followed through with that promise. And Abram is discouraged, and he's worried about who's going to be his successor. He doesn't have any children, and so he's really worried about that and discouraged because God hasn't followed through. And God makes another promise to him and says, look, you're going to have your own child. I'm going to give you a child. Don't worry about that. And then they go on to talk about the land and those things. And we see Abram, he's a little discouraged. But God reminds him that he's faithful and just to be patient. And so God, in this section in Genesis 15, he gives some more specifics of the promise that he made in Genesis 12. So he's laying out more details than he did in Genesis 12. And then we see a major prediction that he makes about the children of Abram, the nation of Israel, the Hebrew people is who we're talking about here. God is making a prediction that one day they will be slaves in a land. They'll be slaves, and they'll be slaves for 400 years. And at the end of that time, at the end of their slavery, when God sets them free, they're actually going to plunder and take the money from the people who were holding them captive. And we see that that's exactly what happens in Egypt. You see, the Hebrew people were enslaved to the Egyptians for 400 years, and it was rough and it was tough. And at the end of that time, when God set them free, they actually did plunder the Egyptians and take a lot of their wealth from them. And so God, he made this promise to Abram, and we actually see that it comes true when we read the book of Exodus. And so that's pretty cool. But the things that we should focus on here is we should be asking the question, why did God choose Abram? What was so special about Abram that God chose him? And we don't get all the details, but we can assume a little bit that he was much like Noah. He was a righteous man, a guy that loved God and honored God with his life. And he was obedient and faithful to God. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He had sin, but he was faithful to God. And we should be asking ourselves, are we like Abram? Are we faithful? Are we quick to turn to God when we make mistakes? And do we obey and listen to God? And then the big picture of this entire thing, God, he made the promise that he was going to bless all the families of the earth through Abram. How did he do that? Did he make good on that promise? And the answer is yes. You see, God, he made this bold prediction. He was going to bless all the nations through Abraham. And he's done that. You see, from Abraham, the Hebrew people were born. And we know, as we continue to read the Bible, that Jesus, the Messiah, the only begotten Son, came from the Hebrew people. And you see, God, he made good on his promise. He blessed all the nations of the earth through through Abraham by sending the Messiah through the Hebrew people. And so to the Hebrew people, they look at Abraham as their father, as their founder, as the one who started the Hebrew people, and he was the father of them. And so the Messiah comes from that lineage. And so God makes good on that promise and is still making good on that promise. He's still blessing families to this day through the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And that's the big picture from this story.